Greetings, fellow Earthlings. So, last week I talked on the subject of purpose, and I think I sort of established this, well, at least I had a stab at establishing a concept that maybe life was a more significant premise for considering your purposes than your purpose in life, maybe based upon life. And I talked about a few things that were maybe less than obvious, and perhaps a little bit of a leap of faith there. Notably, I sort of ascribed that life might actually be a side effect of the process of entropic decay. Interesting assertion to make, and it's a little bit of a leap. I described the manner in which that might happen. You can go back and watch the previous video if that will give you the context to go on with. In fact, if you don't know what I'm talking about, go watch the previous video. But still, it was a little bit of a leap. And if you want to get from the notion that there's some kind of a complex process going on as entropy happens, and that can support some complex thing like life. A little bit of a leap there, but there's a lot of indications that this can in fact be the case. Now, a lot of research has been done on that sort of front over time. There's way back in the I think 70s or so, there was this idea getting around called chaos theory. Chaos theory was, at some level, was just mathematical, but it was describing how complex behaviour can emerge from relatively simple systems. So quite simple things happening produces recurring behaviours. There's some quite simple cases of that, and some simple simulations that show how easily that does in fact actually happen. Maybe you've heard of a thing. It was called Conway's Game of Life. Conway's Game of Life had some really simple rules. It was just a simulation. It said, let's take the notion of what we call a cellular automata. It's just a grid. Imagine a grid where in each cell of the grid, there's a sort of rows by columns like a table, and in each cell of that table, there's either a bit of thing we're saying is life or a bit of thing that's not. And from one generation to the next, it would decide whether a particular cell continues having life in it, or whether a particular cell doesn't have life in it. And you can make some incredibly simple rules. The rules that, a set of rules that work quite well is simply that you say, look, any particular cell which is empty at the moment, but which has three neighbours which have life in them, will spawn new life. And in any cell that currently has life in it, if it's got 3 or 4 neighbours with life around it, as in it's not too lonely, gets to continue having life in it, otherwise it dies off. So you can sort of, by not having enough life around you, or by having way too much because overcrowding, you die off. And if you just got the right amount of life around you, then new life happens. Very, very simple rules, really incredibly trivial. And yet it turns out you can sort of have conditions which comply with these rules alone that produce some of the most extraordinary behaviour. I have an example here. These rules are so simple they can easily be programmed onto any computer. And in fact, I have an application like this on my mobile phone, which I'll show to you here. Each of the little dots on this are a bit of life, and all the dark areas are bits of non-light, and they just follow these really, really simple rules. Right here, you have an example of this in operation. So what you can see is In fact, every individual one of those little cells is just obeying this dumb little rule. And yet look at the behaviour it exhibits. The little squares to the left and right at the top there, they're consistent. They stay the same from each generation to the next because they're pretty stable. And those little things that are zipping backwards and forwards between them, again, just following those simple rules. But as a side effect of those simple rules, they're generating these little gliders, they're called, which are again little things just following the same simple stupid little rules. And so what we have there is a recurring activity. Now consider what that means. A recurring, repeating activity can fall out of just the most trivial of initial conditions with the most trivial of simple little rules. And, even basic chemistry in the world has enough cases of simple rules that can be, when you toss things together the right way, simple rules are followed and recurring behaviour happens. I mean, at another sort of meta level even, I expect just the fact that I'm running this simulation here on a phone. The simulation looks like it within the simulation itself. Of course, it's not actually producing any entropic decay, you'd think, but actually it kind of is, because there's energy required to run the simulation, and that energy is dissipating in the form of heat and creating greater disorder in the world. See, everywhere that these rules operate, there's often catalytic functions going on, things that recur, that produce a consistent recurring behaviour, and in the process of iterating through that persistent recurring behaviour, they generate decay in the world of entropy. So that's actually quite common. In fact, it's so common, it's the essence of all of life we can see. When you see even just single cellular life, this is what's going on. Cells sit there like a bacteria or whatever, they sit there in their environment. They can be relatively passive, waiting for the right conditions to turn up, that then triggers them into doing something, to consume some food, to if they've consumed enough food and the conditions are right, to split and form two of themselves and reproduce, to generally follow their dictates. In fact, when you examine bacteria more closely, you discover that they even have collective signalling. Bacteria of the same type actually look out for signals from similar bacteria that are in type, that when they see the signals from them, they see a lot of those signals coming to them as a chemical signaler. They can know that they're all operating together, and there are many of them, so many of the same bacteria around in the same area, and then only under those conditions do they go virulent and start actually trying to consume and trying to reproduce as much as they can, because they think, well, there's a lot of us here, we're in numbers, it must be good, we can go rampant. So there's sort of a efficiency thing going on there. Each organism there is, whilst when it can get away with it, it's busily, as I think I said last time, consuming energy, passing it through itself, and leaving entropic decay in its wake. This is the behaviour of all life. We're all doing that. We're all constantly bashing away, generating that. But we strive to do it efficiently. I mean, if you go trying to do that to the max all of the time, it may well result in your demise and ultimately a lower efficiency, because you stop doing it. So all of life strives to make this this process, to keep being able to exert the same process, to keep on generating the decay, even if that means backing off for a while and waiting until the opportunity and the time is right. Strike when the iron is hot, do it, and it sort of also explains why, as individuals, as collectives, as businesses, as governments, and so on, we strive for efficiency. Efficiency is just code for, do this, execute this process of entropic decay in a way that's gets us the most output for the lowest input. So, sure, do the whole entropic decay thing, but get the best value for it. And even in it suggests even things about environmentalism. It's not. I mean, just because I'm suggesting that we are a byproduct of entropy doesn't mean that a valid conclusion from that is that we should maximise entropy. In fact, no, it's sort of quite the opposite. We want to maximise the amount of life that we get out of producing the entropy that we produce. It's sort of the reverse way around. So that's where we're at. We consider efficiency to be important in our lives. Efficiency is important because of all that, right? Now, there's also some, once you understand that these sorts of processes go on, you can start to broaden your conceptualization of all this and look a little more widely. Now, for example, the original chaos theory way of understanding this sort of behaviour posited a few broadly interesting characteristics. One of them was that chaotic systems in general, they're recurring systems. To get a good mental conceptualization, how should you think about them? Perhaps imagine that in the world there are some things that are very, very static. Rocks are pretty damn static. And then there's things that are really quite chaotic. Turbulence, just energy streaming through a system violently, very chaotic, the other end of the spectrum. And neither of these systems, neither of these states produce anything that's meaningfully recurring over long periods of time. The static things don't produce any complex, interesting behaviour, and chaotic things kind of don't either. But if you think of this as a spectrum, well, as a spectrum it's more interesting because in the middle there is this sweet spot where a system has sufficient stability that it doesn't just fall apart, and yet has sufficient dynamic behaviour that it adapts to changing conditions. And at the convergence of these two things there's an amazing sweet spot, and that's where all the interesting stuff goes on. You've got a system that is static enough and yet complex enough that it is recurring, and it sort of adapts to conditions and so on. Now, that sounds vaguely sort of odd and like, what the hell is he talking about? But look at some examples in the world of systems that are in fact exactly like this. There's me, there's you, there's life itself. These systems, a living organism is a thing that's constantly on the brink of chaos. There's gazillions of cells all kind of doing their own thing, but yet working in unison. There's a constant ongoing sort of chaotic behaviour. There is turbulence in our blood flow. There is chaotic things going on in our brains, and yet there is enough sort of constancy about it that it persists in its behaviour. even when you look down at things like the way that your heart operates, it's really weird. If it one of the peculiar symptoms that I've read about in medical research documents, suggests that when your heart actually, at some really fine level, becomes the heart rate becomes too static, it's actually an indicator of an imminent heart attack. There's a natural sort of oscillation where your heart rate meanders backwards and forwards around a small range of heart rates. There may be only a few beats per second variation just as you're sitting at rest. That variation is normal. If it stops happening, if it becomes too constant, too static, that is, it's an indicator that something's wrong and it's probably going to stop working right. Again, this sort of same convergence of chaotic and dynamic behaviour turns up in all sorts of systems. Take a look at a stock exchange. That's a level of lots of people interacting together. Lots of people trying to buy and sell, lots of people trying to run companies where they want stability, lots of people trying to tear it apart. So you've got these sort of forces that are trying to drive it to new behaviour, and you've got these forces that are trying to keep it doing the things it always did well. And somewhere between them, it has a constancy, a continuity. The same thing happens in ecosystems, animals and plants. There's a constancy to it that emerges from the conflicting inputs of dynamic behaviour, chaotic things that want to change it, and the static behaviours that want to keep it the same. There's a broad term that's used in chaos theory to describe the resulting behaviour. They would call it mathematically a strange attractor. It's the idea of a system that oscillates around a vaguely constant sort of a state. And in fact, all these complex systems behave exactly according like that. When you look at your body, it tries to gravitate towards a constant state of moderate health. If it becomes sick, it tries to cure itself. If you exert yourself and your heart rate and everything else goes up, and it tries to revert back to a norm. Your body is constantly trying to maintain your blood pressure, your pH level, your levels of excitement, your levels versus levels of depression. Just every different thing is trying to be maintained in balance whilst oscillating around a norm. Now, one of the characteristics of these strange attractor kind of states is that you can push a system to try and, if you're sitting on the outside of it and you push it and you try to change it away from this default constant state, and what happens is the system will resist. It'll try and push its way back. So even when you exert your body and it reverts back afterwards to its normal oscillating state, you put a bit of a squeeze on an economy and it oscillates a bit and it reverts back to its kind of normal state. You squeeze an ecosystem, you try and you act like an external predator for a while, you kill off some of the animals, but it all reverts back to a normal state. The same climates. A climate is actually, the world's climate is in fact a strange attractor state. Incidentally, there's been more than one consistent oscillating kind of strange attractor as a normal state for a climate, for example. The ice ages from many years gone by that existed has an odd continuity to itself. The ice covering the planet reflects light away, and so keeps it in a cooler state, which in turn keeps there being more ice and so on. So a further characteristic of these chaotic states, these strange attractor states of complex systems, is in fact that they not only do they try to maintain the state, if you keep pushing them and they keep trying to revert to the normal state, but when you keep on pushing them like this, oddly what sort of happens is that if you push them too hard, eventually they'll just flip. They'll flip from one state to another state, and that other state will then be a self-maintaining state nevertheless. So you can be, as a body, for example, a human body or animal body, you could be in a relatively healthy state, and you can, if you persist on, putting a lot of pressure on that, you can push your body into being into some other unhealthy state, which again will be self-maintaining. You can live your life as a complete fucking slob, where you don't maintain your system, you just, you do, but you maintain it in an unhealthy state, and that will be self-consistent, self-reinforcing, and that'll go on. Or you can push yourself and push, change that, and then one day it'll flip to a new state, and you'll be maintaining yourself in a really, really healthy state, and that in itself will also be self-reinforcing. This happens in the state of a human body. It happens in the state of a climate. As I say, an ice age is a self-reinforcing, consistent, persistent state as a strange attractor for a climate. Likewise, the current temperate state that we've been in, we've all enjoyed from our climates for the last centuries, is also a self-consistent, self-maintaining, strange attractor kind of a state. And it's interesting. Some scientific researchers have done ice core studies where they've drilled down into places like Antarctica and Greenland to look through these ice cores, which essentially gives you a view back into history, and you can see what the climate was like back at the time when different layers of ice were laid down. You can see how much carbon dioxide is trapped in there, and you can see a variety of other clues that give you some idea what the climate was like. And what's most telling when you look at these cores is that you can see how long it took to change state from one climatic state into another. And you might think, we're talking glacial kind of periods here, that to go from an ice age to a temperate or vice versa, you might think, that sort of a change would take, centuries, thousands of years or something, because it's long kind of, geological sort of time frames or something. But the truth is, it's not. The transitions between ice age and not happened over periods of only small numbers of tens of years. In sort of archaeological time frames, it's the blink of an eye. These things happened really quite fast. As I say, the transition from one state, one persistent, strange attractor kind of state in these complex systems, it's a flip-flop. It's a flip of state from one self-maintaining state to another. It happens almost in the blink of an eye. It's true for our lives, it's true for economies, it's true for ecosystems, and it's true for the climate. It's one of those little life lessons we should probably all learn if we spend a little less time worshipping imaginary friends, and a little more time considering what might be best for life, then maybe we'd have some different answers. Anyway, I've probably wallowed along long enough tonight, but there you go. There's a extension to the previous one. It takes the discussion about life as a philosophical grounding to perhaps a new level. I hope you enjoy. Thanks for now. Subscribe or something, because that's what we do. Ta-ra.